Winter pressed against Moscow like a gloved hand, quieting even the breath of the city. On the Kremlin's tall flagpole, the red banner that had lived through parades and crises began its final descent. Frost traced silver veins across the metal. The rope moved without drama, and the cloth surrendered to gravity with the softness of a curtain at the end of a long performance. There were no sirens, no salvo of artillery, no rush of boots through snow. The wind raised a faint rustle, more tired than triumphant, and the city's lamps blinked in their frozen halos. In apartments with bird windows, people leaned toward the screen glow of late-night television, watched the emblem fade, and felt a sensation without a name, part resignation, part relief, part emptiness that followed a season of strain. The buildings remained, the river steamed faintly, the subway thundered, and yet something had shifted that could not be measured in decibels or degrees. An empire ended as a day ends, sliding into dusk without protest. In that silence lay the question that would guide the story. How could a state that had armed itself against every imaginable enemy surrender to nothing more than its own breath? The camera of memory pulled back from the pole, from the walls, until the city became a pattern of lights on snow. Behind those walls, history had spent itself on decrees and plans. In the distance, a different flag rose. In the near distance, nothing moved at all. The world had changed overnight, and the sound of that change was the muffled scrape of rope against metal. The silence asked again and again, what carried the banner down, if not defeat? The answer would not be found in a single room or a single hour, but in decades of weight, slowly accumulating until even the strongest arm learned to lower itself. Where had the weight begun to gather, and why had no one heard the timbers creak?
To understand the end, the film turned its gaze to the middle, when the Soviet Union stood at a height that seemed unassailable. Maps shaded a sixth of the earth in one color. Textbooks spoke of 5-year miracles. Factories hammered out steel that became rails, hulls, and frames for aircraft that cut the high, thin air. A vocabulary of progress framed every dawn. Targets, fulfillment, over-fulfillment. Youth paraded with banners of science. Portraits of cosmonauts gazed outward, as if the future were a sky with no turbulence. The state measured life in tonnage and kilowatts, in hectares and launch windows, in the certainty that history moved like a conveyor toward equality. The streets smelled of coal and oil and fresh bread pulled from communal ovens, though the latter was never quite enough for the crowds that formed. In that era, fear and pride coexisted like neighbors who nodded at each other but never spoke. Both helped people rise in the morning. Both taught them to avoid unnecessary questions. Glory arrived in planned doses. A satellite that orbited the Earth. A flag planted in the language of mathematics. Yet beneath the banners, a different arithmetic began to tick. A system designed to punish failure learned to avoid risk. A culture that promised new thinking learned to repeat. Quotas replaced curiosity and ticked forward like metronomes, keeping time for entire industries that hummed without improvisation. The leadership read graphs and saw ascent. The factories read the same graphs and produced what they must. The gap between report and reality widened by the thickness of a paper sheet each quarter. A thickness that would one day measure an abyss. If the peak was unquestioned, the air there was already thin. What happens to ambition when the measure of success can no longer fit the texture of daily life?
From the first day of the Cold War to its final mood, the contest was as much psychological as strategic. Two systems looked at each other through a glass of numbers, and the glass magnified everything. Missiles lengthened, payloads doubled, warning times shrank into the space of a heartbeat. In design bureaus scented with solder and rubber, engineers chased improvements that would never appear on a supermarket shelf. The nation poured attention into alloys and trajectories, while elevator buttons stuck and public telephones crackled with static. The cost of presence on a global stage was paid by absent goods at home. Propaganda showed clean, gleaming clinics and unwrinkled overalls. Reality showed shine in certain places and shortage in others, like a suit tailored perfectly in the jacket and unfinished in the trousers. Image required discipline. Discipline required resources. Resources required belief. The cycle fed on itself until show and substance became hard to separate. Abroad, the Union projected an ideal of iron reliability. At home, people learned to queue with stoic skill, turning waiting into a social technology. A woman might balance a child on one hip and a ration book on the other, reading the board that listed what had arrived and what had not, while a loudspeaker repeated a march that no one marched to anymore. The state could orbit the planet. It could not always deliver toilet paper. This was not humiliation, it was erosion, slow as breath on glass. In this contest, both giants spent to appear tireless, but only one had a consumer valve to release pressure. The other kept turning the wrench tighter each year. How long can a system move faster than the speed of its own repair?
The decade named for Brezhnev carried the fragrance of stagnation like dust that settles invisibly until a sunbeam reveals it. Stability was the watchword, and the hallway carpets of power learned every footfall. Ministers aged into their chairs, factories updated slogans instead of machines. The bureaucracy perfected the art of filing the future under pending. Growth did not vanish, but it lost its stride. The plan still arrived each January, but its numbers stepped carefully around reality, polite as guests. Workers fulfilled targets by redefining what counted. Smaller screws, thicker paint, the product shipped in December no matter its condition. Cities acquired new districts of concrete towers, yet the elevators languished. Hospitals gained equipment that sat covered beneath neat cloths. Farms delivered harvests that curdled while seeking transport. The system had not failed, it had hardened. The absence of catastrophe became a boast, and the avoidance of change passed for calm. In apartments, the television softened the edges of fatigue, and in kitchens, talk learned to curve around the table like steam. People made lives within the frame, raising children who were promised a horizon that never advanced or retreated. The top of the pyramid looked at calm statistics and saw permanence. The base looked at the same calm and saw stillness that could not last.
When a state chooses immobility, it relies on the world to remain still with it. The world did not. In that quiet, the metabolism of decline slowed enough to hide itself. But every body, even the largest, keeps time. Where would the first tremor show itself if not in the places where motion had been postponed too long?
The tremor came from mountains and deserts far from home. Afghanistan drew the Union into a landscape that consumed certainty. Trains loaded with equipment left to the thud of ceremonial speeches and came back with windows filmed by dust and grief. The war required logistics that stretched like old rope, and each knot tied to secure a convoy meant another knot tightened around the domestic belt. Factories that might have produced appliances shifted to spare parts. Hospitals that might have replaced worn X-ray bulbs reallocated to trauma. Young men who might have built bridges learned to scan valleys for figures who were not there until they were. The war did not become a Stalingrad of the mind. No defining battle, no single winter of hunger. But it became a long subtraction. Morale thinned at the edges. A fabric pulled hand over hand until the weave showed light. Wounds returned in silence and sat at kitchen tables without appetite for narrative. The leadership maintained the language of commitment. The public learned the language of adjustment. The treasury counted and recounted, surviving each year by leaning a little more on debt, saleable raw materials, and the patience of citizens. The war's chief effect was not rebellion, but weariness, a wordless consensus that the margin for error at home had narrowed. When soldiers returned, they found different shortages than the ones they had left, but shortages all the same. The empire could still command force, it could not command enthusiasm. When a power learns it can win skirmishes but not restore belief, what battlefield remains open to it?
Chernobyl tore a seam in the fabric of secrecy that had held since the earliest security decrees. In the spring air of 1986, a reactor's misjudged dance with physics became a fire that wrote itself into clouds. The event was technical, but its aftershocks were linguistic. For decades, the state had managed truth by scheduling it. Now truth arrived unscheduled, carried by Geiger counters, foreign monitors, and the taste of iodine. Streets were washed, buses rerouted, parcels of information wrapped and unwrapped, but the particles moved with their own stubbornness. The public sensed contradiction in the way a person senses a draft from a supposedly sealed window. Parents weighed official reassurances against the weight of their own unease. Scientists calculated half-lives. Citizens recalculated trust. The disaster did not only contaminate land, it contaminated the habit of assuming that the center could always decide when reality became public. The silence that had held back many discomforts began to sound different, less protective, more like a wall absorbing knocks. In offices, mid-level officials rehearsed new phrases. In homes, people bought produce with a thought they did not voice. The defect was not merely mechanical, it was systemic. the difficulty of admitting that a complex world could not be kept inside a set of authorized sentences. After Chernobyl, the map of the Union included regions of uncertainty that no cartographer could color. If the state could not fully control the narration of a reactor's failure, how would it control the narration of its own limits?
A leader stepped into that atmosphere with a vocabulary that promised air. Mikhail Gorbachev did not arrive as savior or saboteur. He arrived as a manager of necessity, one who saw that the ledger no longer balanced and that the language that had kept it balanced no longer persuaded. Perestroika and glasnost were not poetic banners. They were tools, blunt and urgent. Restructuring sought to restore productivity by loosening the knots that had become strangling. Openness sought to recover credibility by admitting what had been concealed. The sealed house needed windows, and windows once opened could not decide which breezes to invite. Journalism found new edges. Literature retrieved manuscripts that had been filed away. Citizens gathered in halls not to overthrow, but to speak. The habit of guarded conversations softened, first in professional councils, then in public squares, then in living rooms where the television showed debates that would have been impossible a year earlier. The economy, meanwhile, staggered under the transition from command to semi-market, a halfway point that offered the chaos of prices without the abundance of goods. Enterprises asked for guidance and received latitude. With latitude came indecision. The ruble learned to wobble, and the shelves learned new patterns of empty and full. The reformers' problem became visible: to change the machine while it ran, to feed the public with both truth and hope, while the meal of improvement cooked too slowly. Openness released truths like spores, some healed, some irritated, all multiplied. If a system survives on myth, what happens when a leader takes away its most comforting story? Across the vastness of the Union, the old chords of identity began to vibrate again. In the Baltics, song became politics without marching boots. In the Caucasus, memory looked up from the past and asked for a seat at the present table. In Ukraine, the language of fields and factories asked for its own calendar. In Central Asia, histories layered under Soviet time pressed for recognition. The center heard these tones as requests, then as negotiations, then as declarations. Autonomy, once a phrase contained in constitutions that nobody read after school, gained weight. Local newspapers printed schedules of meetings where the subject was no longer only supply plans, but sovereignty. Flags came out of drawers where they had slept beside family photographs. The KGB watched with the caution of a force that understood the new rules only vaguely. The army waited for clear instructions that never quite arrived because clarity would have required a decision no one wanted to own. The past had not been erased, only paused, and now it resumed. The empire discovered that its strength had relied not merely on tanks and secret files, but on a kind of collective politeness. The politeness frayed, not with riots that overturned everything at once, but with refusals to nod, refusals to pretend, refusals to attend a meeting where the outcome had been pre-written. When people ceased to pretend,
the scaffolding of authority creaks. The center could still issue orders. The periphery could still receive them. But the journey from desk to compliance lengthened, and time itself devoured the message. When a command arrives after belief has departed, what does it command?
Economically, the late 1980s became a corridor where lights flickered, some brighter, some burning out. Enterprises tested cooperatives that worked like islands of initiative in a sea of habit. Storefronts appeared with foreign goods in displays that drew crowds who came as much to look as to buy, because prices danced ahead of wages. Inflation crept first, then trotted, carrying confusion on its back. Barter returned as a quiet technology. Factories traded pipes for fuel. Clinics traded repairs for supplies. Neighbors traded favors for favors. The official plan tried to retain its posture, but the informal plan grew more muscular each month. The state's fiscal lungs grew short of breath. Deficits accumulated behind phrases that no longer concealed them. To adjust, the center granted more latitude to republics, hoping flexibility would produce responsibility. Instead, flexibility revealed independence. Tax revenues held back, trade redirected. Local leaders spoke of our resources with a tone that left little space for the plural. The psychological climate changed as well. Fatigue replaced fear in workplaces. Sarcasm replaced slogans in canteens. Hope relocated from the vertical promise of the center to the horizontal promise of neighbors and local councils. No barricades appeared. People simply redirected their attention, a more devastating shift than any barricade. The economy had always been an agreement as much as a machine. The agreement was not renewed. When the ledger ceases to convince, who signs it?
In August 1991, the old guard attempted to rewind the film. Tanks appeared on city streets like punctuation marks left over from an earlier grammar. Yet even in this show of steel, the tone was tentative. Commands issued but faltered, as soldiers listened not only to orders, but to a climate that had cooled on coercion. Citizens stood near armored vehicles, not as combatants, but as witnesses. Institutions hesitated as if tired of their own reflexes. The putsch collapsed under the weight of its own uncertainty, and with it, the idea that power could be reimposed by gesture. The months that followed accelerated the erosion that years had prepared. Republics formalized their departure with meetings, signatures, and press briefings that felt administrative rather than revolutionary. The Union's organs continued to function as if nothing essential had changed, while everything essential slipped away. By December, the machinery had become a theater prop, realistic in detail, hollow in use. The final documents were not dramatic. They were tired and precise, listing assets and borders, debts and obligations, as if dissolving a company. Pens moved, coats rustled, and the era concluded. In the Kremlin, the red banner descended as if obeying gravity rather than decree. The world woke into a morning with the same clouds and different maps. The narrative returned to the flagpole, to the rope,
to the slow unwinding of color against stone. If no decisive battle marked the end, then perhaps the decisive element had been time itself. But whose time had run out, and what would fill the hours left behind? Internationally, the silence of the finale echoed in a new vocabulary of partnership. Treaties that had once required tense choreography now unfolded with an unfamiliar courtesy. These strategic arsenals, immense, redundant, expensive, demanded attention in a world where attention had migrated to budgets and currencies. Inspectors walked through bases and silos, counting, sealing, and recording, while economists drafted programs to stabilize exchange rates that swayed like ships at anchor. The global order adjusted its focus from confrontation to management, from brinksmanship to spreadsheets. The absence of a final battle produced a different legacy. Fewer monuments, more memoranda. The narrative observed foreign capitals recalibrating aid, investment, and diplomacy, as if rearranging furniture in a room whose central wall had vanished. The shift was not triumphalist, it was procedural. Markets opened in some places like floodgates, in others like narrow sluices. Foreign brands arrived, sometimes as symbols of promise, sometimes as symbols of intrusion. The world did not agree on meaning, but it agreed on motion. In that motion lay both opportunity and disorientation. The Cold War had organized expectations. Its end disorganized them. The camera lingered on conference tables where the new rules were drafted, and then drifted back to shop counters where new prices were chalked. How would these two surfaces, polished wood and worn laminate, translate each other's decisions without a translator as powerful as fear? To understand the end, the film turned its gaze to the middle, when the Soviet Union stood at a height that seemed unassailable. Maps shaded a sixth of the Earth in one color. Textbooks spoke of 5-year miracles. Factories hammered out steel that became rails, hulls, and frames for aircraft that cut the high, thin air. A vocabulary of progress framed every dawn. Targets, fulfillment, overfulfillment. Youth paraded with banners of science. Portraits of cosmonauts gazed outward as if the future were a sky with no turbulence. The state measured life in tonnage and kilowatts, in hectares and launch windows, in the certainty that history moved like a conveyor toward equality. The streets smelled of coal and oil and fresh bread pulled from communal ovens, though the latter was never quite enough for the crowds that formed. In that era, fear and pride coexisted like neighbors who nodded at each other but never spoke. Both helped people rise in the morning. Both taught them to avoid unnecessary questions. Glory arrived in planned doses, a satellite that orbited the Earth, a flag planted in the language of mathematics. Yet beneath the banners, a different arithmetic began to tick. A system designed to punish failure learned to avoid risk. A culture that promised new thinking learned to repeat. Quotas replaced curiosity and ticked forward like metronomes, keeping time for entire industries that hummed without improvisation. The leadership read graphs and saw assent. The factories read the same graphs and produced what they must.
the gap between report and reality widened by the thickness of a paper sheet each quarter, a thickness that would one day measure an abyss. If the peak was unquestioned, the air there was already thin. What happens to ambition when the measure of success can no longer fit the texture of daily life? The film returned to the earlier decades to trace the economic grammar that had prepared this quiet ending. Targets had taught factories to build quantity before usefulness. Scarcity had trained consumers to value acquisition over choice. Information had traveled upward more smoothly than downward, producing leaders who often knew how much steel was smelted, but not how many refrigerators failed within a month. Over time, this grammar created feedback that soothed the center while unsettling the periphery. Success was documented. Failure was reformulated. Innovation appeared in bursts when a crisis demanded it, and then receded into the routine. The unintended result was a resistance to novelty, not from ideology alone, but from practice. When meeting the plan was the virtue, deviation became suspect, even when fruitful. The narrative treated this not as a moral tale, but as a mechanical one. Any system that penalizes variance will eventually shrink its capacity to adapt. The Cold War amplified this tendency by rewarding visibility of strength over flexibility of supply. Rockets lifted national confidence. Light bulbs on store shelves lifted households. But the first was measured and celebrated, while the second was absorbed into daily life without parades. By the late 1970s, the imbalance had solidified into culture. When culture resists adjustment, policy must push harder. When policy pushes without changing culture, it wears itself out. The wear did not shout, it accumulated. If the end came softly, it was because the weakening had been silent for years. How then could the late 1980s have concluded any other way than softly? The psychological section of fear had been a structural element since the Civil War years, a beam embedded in foundations. It did not always appear as terror. Often it appeared as caution, as the calculation that an unnecessary question might cost a promotion or invite scrutiny. This caution seeped from offices into workshops, from editorial desks into classrooms, until it calcified into a way of living. Fear is efficient in the short term. It accelerates compliance, but it is corrosive in the long term because it suppresses feedback. In the Soviet case, the corrosion took the form of self-censorship, so habitual that even benign criticism struggled to surface. Once glasnost relaxed the clamp, the pressure released unevenly. Some spoke with relief, others with resentment, and many simply exhaled the years they had spent holding their breath. The state found it could no longer curate discourse with the old finesse. Trust, once dented, did not return on command. The film treated this as a physiological metaphor. A society's nervous system had been trained to expect pain for speaking. Removing the stimulus did not immediately restore normal sensation. It produced numbness, then tingling, then overreaction. Thus, when institutions hesitated in 1991, it was not merely because they feared resistance. It was because their reflexes had grown unreliable. A body unsure of its reflexes chooses stillness. Stillness, in that moment, looked like peace. But was it also the quiet of a limb that had fallen asleep too long?
National income had floated for years on commodities: oil, gas, metals, timber. When global prices sagged in key stretches of the 1980s, the cushion thinned. A planned system is supposed to buffer such swings with reserves and reallocation. A tired system relies on them. Revenues narrowed, imports became harder to finance, technology purchases that might have modernized production were postponed into a perpetually arriving next year. The leadership pursued joint ventures and licensing agreements, discovering that integration into the world market required procedures and guarantees that conflicted with domestic habits. Contracts wanted predictability. Predictability wanted legal frameworks. Legal frameworks wanted an authority that could enforce them without improvisation. The gap between desire and capacity widened. Enterprises faced with partial liberalization behaved rationally, hoarding inputs, delaying outputs, cultivating side channels. The result resembled a drought, not the absence of water, but its capture in private reservoirs. Households encountered this drought as lines and empty bins. Managers encountered it as spreadsheets that refused to balance. The empire's strategic posture still looked formidable, but its cash flow had learned fragility. The camera followed the flow not to assign blame, but to show a simple principle. An organism that spends too much energy on posture risks starving its muscles. When a drop in price far away can alter bread at home, sovereignty becomes arithmetic on a global abacus. How long can political will substitute for denominators?
Culture carried parallel stories. On stages and in samizdat, in cinema and in humor told softly at kitchen tables, people rehearsed an alternative mirror. Art does not topple states by itself. It tunes emotions, and tuned emotions change what citizens will accept. Over time, the heroic realism of earlier decades yielded to ambivalence, then to irony, then to a compassionate realism that acknowledged fatigue. Music borrowed from abroad, literature borrowed from memory, and both borrowed from the present's contradiction, pride entwined with doubt. When openness arrived, these threads braided into public discourse. The impact was not a wave that broke. It was a tide that withdrew legitimacy grain by grain. A society that has learned to laugh at an official fiction has already diminished that fiction's power, not with contempt, but with distance. The film explored these textures slowly, book covers spread on a table, posters peeling on a wall, a censored scene restored in a late-night broadcast. These were not weapons, they were solvents,
dissolving the glue of imposed certainty. By 1991, the audience did not hunger for confrontation, it hungered for coherence. Confrontation promised noise, coherence promised rest. If an empire can survive anger, can it survive indifference? The non-battle ending also owed much to the evolution of the security organs. Built for a world of clandestine threats and clear internal lines, they faced a landscape where legitimacy, not insurgency, was the central risk. To intervene overtly would have required confidence in both mission and outcome. Both were clouded. The institutions had already been tasked with reforming themselves, an assignment that dulled their appetite for dramatic action. Moreover, the memory of earlier crackdowns elsewhere had taught a lesson. Televised force in a globalizing media environment could delegitimize faster than it could stabilize. The calculus then favored observation over suppression, memoranda over arrests, caution over zeal. The spectacle of mass terror belongs to a different era. The tools of the present were dossiers, leaks, and persuasion. In this register, the end could arrive without alarms, because the alarms had been disconnected by design. Stability meant avoiding headlines. Avoiding headlines meant avoiding decisive moves. Thus, the guardians of the order watched the order recede like a shoreline at low tide, knowing that rushing the water would not bring it back. The restraint preserved lives and ruined myths. If the state's steadiest arm chooses not to clench, what signal does that send to every other limb? The narrative then measured the quiet arithmetic of demographics, a population aging in key sectors, a birth rate that had slipped, a health profile burdened by alcohol and workplace hazards. These facts did not shout on podiums, but they whispered in productivity tables and in the cadence of neighborhoods. Young cohorts that might have carried reform with stamina were fewer than needed. Experienced cadres guarded routines, because routines were what their bodies and ambitions could still manage. Urbanization had created sprawling districts where infrastructure lagged, and rural depopulation strained collective farms that had already learned to meet targets with creative accounting. Education produced brilliant specialists, and also produced graduates whose skills met yesterday's machines. These were not failings unique to one system. They were the ordinary fictions of late modernity. But layered atop fiscal stress and ideological fatigue, they made acceleration difficult. A society can absorb a single pressure. Multiple pressures change its gait. The quiet finale thus had a biological aspect. The body of the Union, large and capable, needed rest at precisely the time history demanded a sprint. Rest arrived not as policy, but as incapacity. If the runner stops without falling, is that defeat, or simply the wisdom of a body that refuses injury?
By the end, the Union's legal architecture unraveled through instruments it had itself authored.
Constitutions that defined republics and their rights became the clauses that enabled departure. Councils created to coordinate became forums to negotiate separation. Signatures once applied to central plans now applied to bilateral treaties. This juridical unwinding prevented civil war in many places where history might have predicted it. The paperwork of dissolution was dense and sometimes tedious, but within its footnotes lived a remarkable restraint. Borders were recognized more often than they were contested. Militaries were partitioned more often than they were unleashed. The cost was ambiguity, overlapping claims, frozen conflicts, unresolved debts. But ambiguity bought time, and time reduced temperature. The absence of a decisive battle did not mean the absence of pain. It meant pain distributed across items of agenda. The narrative flipped through pages of agreements, noticing that the pen, a minor actor in most revolutions, had become central here. When a pen replaces a rifle, the casualties are counted in uncertainties rather than bodies. Uncertainties can heal or infect, depending on what follows, what would follow, and who would write the schedule. In the months after the flag descended, 15 states began to breathe on their own, some deeply, some shallowly. Currencies appeared with new names and old problems. Parliaments assembled with mixed furniture and mixed mandates. Central banks learned the craft of credibility while learning the craft of printing. The market arrived not as a single creature, but as a swarm. Traders at kiosks, privatizations on paper, foreign consultants with binders, local entrepreneurs with suitcases, criminals with networks, pensioners with savings that shrank in real time. The social contract, once vertical, dispersed into contracts, plural, negotiated, often improvised. Some found opportunity intoxicating, others found it dizzying, many found it both. The geopolitical map stabilized faster than the moral map. What counted as fair? What counted as theft? What counted as reform and what as liquidation? The sleep promised by the film's subtitle was not immediate. It was a restless doze, full of adjustments. Yet the central point held. The last empire of the industrial age had not collapsed through cannon fire. It had stepped aside, heavy with years, and let gravity complete what policy had begun. The question that remains at the edge of this quiet is not why there was no final battle, but whether a final battle would have told the truth any better than a silent lowering of cloth. And if silence was the truest ending, what does that say about the beginnings now underway?
The social fabric did not tear. It thinned, then rewove itself with different threads. Blocks of concrete apartments relearned the economics of stairwells, bulbs replaced by collective agreement, repairs funded by envelopes passed between neighbors, disputes settled on benches where old women counted both coins and stories. Rural villages weighed whether to stay with land that no longer had a clear buyer, or to follow cousins into cities where kiosks bloomed like metal flowers. Trade routes adjusted at human scale, suitcases crossing borders by bus, goods moving from trunk to table. The state's former omnipotence retreated into paperwork, and in its place arrived the intimacy of favors. Trust shifted from institutions to persons, a gentle regression that felt natural because it was familiar.
Yet such trust could not build bridges or power plants. It could only help someone find cooking oil or a job or a doctor who would see them before the queue. The promise of equality had curdled into a promise of personal networks, and that change altered the aroma of an entire street. In this everyday negotiation lay the answer to why there was no final battle. The front line had scattered into kitchens. But what happens when history moves from the public square to the stove? The rise of fortunes followed the decline of certainties. Assets that once belonged to everyone and no one needed owners, and the process of assigning ownership hardened into a race. In auction halls and back rooms, in ministerial offices and on river docks, titles moved faster than understanding could chase them. The new class of magnates dressed the transition in the language of efficiency, while critics described it as the conversion of influence into property. Both views held pieces of the truth. A planned economy had accumulated enormous stock without forming habits of valuation. In the vacuum, those who could price risk or could price relationships took command. Money that had been an accounting entry became a lever. Paper that had been a permit became a claim. The narrative approached this not as scandal, but as physics. Where pressure drops, currents surge. The culture of scarcity became a culture of opportunity for a few, and of sudden exposure for many. The consequences would reverberate for decades in politics and memory. But in the moment, the significance was simpler. A society accustomed to silent wealth in the form of shared utilities now confronted visible wealth in cars, restaurants, and guarded gates. If wealth appears overnight, can legitimacy wake as quickly?
The military, once the most disciplined organ, contracted like a muscle after overuse. Officers who had trained to defend a continental border now mapped their careers onto smaller maps. Bases closed or transferred. Units split along new flags. Soldiers chose allegiance by geography, oath, or paycheck. The most delicate matter, nuclear arms, demanded a choreography without rehearsal. Control systems, codes, and storage sites were consolidated under arrangements that mixed prudence with improvisation. This delicate consolidation succeeded not through heroism, but through the banality of professionalism. Officers following checklists, diplomats drafting clauses, technicians maintaining seals, all while aware that error would be catastrophic. The absence of a final battle was mirrored by the absence of a final panic. The nerves of an entire strategic complex held steady enough. The larger army, deprived of purpose and pay, drifted toward demobilization and side work. The uniform remained a symbol, but the salary in its pocket decided loyalties. The empire had melted into separate states. The sword, once a single blade, became a set of shears. Could a structure built to project power outward learn to fold itself inward without cutting the hand that guided it?
Memory became a marketplace. Museums curated exhibitions that revisited terrors long suppressed and triumphs long ritualized. School books changed diagrams before they changed tone, and in that lag lived confusion. Monuments were removed carefully in some places, hurriedly in others, and sometimes not at all, left to weather into ambiguity. The veterans of earlier wars carried decorations whose meanings shifted with every speech. Families opened drawers and found documents that answered questions they had not yet formed. The narrative treated memory as currency, inflated in moments of pride, devalued in moments of doubt, accepted here, rejected there. In the absence of a final battle, there was no single story to pin to a date. Instead, memory divided by region, by language, by profession, by the personal fate of a grandfather. The decline of a central myth produced a surplus of local myths, tender and stubborn. The film's voice remained neutral, tracing how memory both heals and hardens. Without a closing victory or defeat, remembrance drifted toward moral bookkeeping. But whose ledger would balance, and whose would remain open to dispute?
Foreign policy, once rigidly opposed, became a field of asymmetrical courtesies. Western institutions expanded their reach with invitations and conditions. The post-Soviet states negotiated from positions that mixed hope with caution. Security alliances grew by accession rather than conquest, each step justified by documents that read like engineering specifications for trust. The silence of 1991 created a diplomatic echo that lasted years. Cautious phrases, careful handshakes, rehearsed smiles. For some, the new order promised safety. For others, it activated old fears under new labels. The absence of a final clash made debate about intentions endless, because there was no decisive event to settle interpretations. The camera dwelled not on maps with arrows, but on corridors with carpets, where officials adjusted their pace to match the mood of partners who might one day be rivals again. The global system tilted toward markets and law, yet retained the memory of force like a scar. In such a world, gestures mattered as much as guns. If the greatest geopolitical shift of the era concluded with signatures, would the next one begin the same way? Or would the quiet end prove an exception that could not be repeated?
Inside apartments, economics changed the weather. Subsidized heat that had once arrived like winter sunlight now arrived with invoices that felt like verdicts. Food that had cost time more than money now cost both. The skill of making do evolved into the skill of making deals. A daughter took a second job teaching languages to men who imported machines. A grandfather started selling stamps collected in a different era. A neighbor converted a garage into a workshop where the sound of metal on metal extended late into the night. Inflation made salaries lighter, and those who had measured life in stable rubles learned the nausea of moving numbers. Markets brought variety to shops, and variety to risk. The film recorded these transitions with respect. No heroics, only recalculations. The quiet end of the Union had left loud arithmetic in households, and the arithmetic taught its own politics. That politics asked simple questions with complex implications. What is fair? What is sustainable? What is owed? If a system ends without gunfire, does the pain simply choose a quieter register, or does it travel, unnoticed, into the bones.
The ideological vacuum did not remain empty. It filled with smaller philosophies that fit in a pocket. Self-help manuals shared shelves with recovered classics. Business seminars shared auditoriums with lectures on national renaissance. Religion, long regulated, stepped forward with the quiet confidence of an institution that understood ceremony better than parties did. Civic groups formed where parties exhausted themselves. Newspapers proliferated, then folded. Television evolved from a state voice into a chorus where capital wrote scripts. Freedom of expression produced not clarity, but volume. And volume demanded filters that citizens built out of habit and kinship. The narrative resisted judgment and instead traced the physics. When a single beam is removed from a roof, the house does not collapse if the rafters rearrange. The rearrangement, however, leaves gaps where rain can enter. People placed buckets under these gaps and continued to sleep. The absence of a final battle had spared the roof from fire. The task now was carpentry. But who would measure and cut when the tools were still being invented?
Industry adapted unevenly. Some plants found foreign partners and modernized lines that had grown tired, adding sensors where eyes once judged, adding logistics where handshakes once sufficed. Others shut their gates and waited for a miracle that did not arrive. Rail yards that had connected an empire now connected exporters to ports. Coal that had heated the ideology now heated contracts. Energy remained the axis on which many hopes turned, and its revenues underwrote the first promises of stability in several capitals. Yet reliance on the geology of advantage echoed an older pattern, one that the Union had known too well. The narrative observed the irony with gentleness. The future again balanced on commodities and transit. New entrepreneurs wrote software in small offices with blinking routers. Old machinists taught young apprentices how to listen to a lathe. The economy breathed through both lungs, one new, one scarred. The quiet end had not prescribed a path. It had only removed the guardrails. When the road widens, do drivers slow from caution or speed from exhilaration?
Across the former borders, families reimagined distance. Cousins divided by new customs. Windows learned to time their visits to holidays and police shifts. Marriages navigated paperwork that shifted like sandbars. Students chose universities with an eye to visas rather than ideology. Migrant labor formed tributaries that flowed toward cities where money pooled, and returned each season to villages where money evaporated. The map acquired a texture of permits and stamps, making movement both possible and anxious. Yet travel also became a quiet teacher. People learned that foreign streets held both comforts and confusions, that supermarkets reduced the drama of food, and that bureaucracy spoke in many languages, but always with the same accent. The narrative let these lessons accumulate like postcards, each one offering a small correction to grand theories. The Soviet dream had promised unity at scale. The new dream promised mobility
at scale. Both had costs that remained invisible until paid. If the empire ended without a war, would the peace end without farewell?
Over time, scholars and citizens reached for comparisons. Rome, which faded more than it fell. Habsburg realms, which dissolved into treaties. Colonial empires, which shed territories with noise and blood. None matched perfectly, because the Soviet case combined internal exhaustion with external endurance. The adversary did not invade. The Allies did not rebel. The center did not command the final defense. The closest analogy was biological. A giant organism that, after years of compensating for strain, lay down. Its rest cleared space for other species, states, markets, cultures to proliferate. The quiet of December 1991 thus became a kind of ecological event in the garden of world affairs. Silence was not absence, it was a medium in which seeds germinated. Some sprouted into order, others into grievance, many into ambiguity. The film returned briefly to the flag lowering, not as a symbol of failure, but as a symbol of completion. The cloth did not tear, it folded. In that fold lay countless creases, each a future line of debate. Which crease would be pressed flat by time, and which would be ironed into a new pattern?
Political forms experimented with their own reflections. Constitutions were drafted in hurried poetry and amended in prose. Elections arrived with banners and left with recounts. Executives learned how to balance inherited security services with newborn courts. Parliaments argued under chandeliers that had watched previous regimes recite unanimity, and the rooms seemed to echo with both relief and impatience. In some capitals, reformers synchronized clocks with international standards and treated transparency as infrastructure. In others, the pendulum swung back toward centralization, the comfort of one voice after the fatigue of many. The borderlands became laboratories for federalism and unitary zeal, for decentralization and its revision. Each design carried a memory of the Union, its reach, its guarantees, its blind spots. The absence of a final battle meant no single faction could claim the laurel, so legitimacy had to be earned by delivery of wages, of safety, of a future that felt less provisional. When potholes shrank and street lights endured the winter, politics gained muscle. When salaries evaporated and officials spoke only in future tense, politics lost blood. The film lingered on ballot boxes lifted into vans, on ink-stained fingers, on the quiet of counting rooms at midnight. These images did not settle the question of how the post-Soviet order would stabilize. They only posed a wider one. Would the structure of trust grow faster than the structure of power?
The natural world, often backgrounded by ideology and industry, stepped into the foreground. Rivers that had carried the runoff of 5-year plans continued to flow past new flags, carrying old burdens. Forests logged for quotas now faced chainsaws guided by prices. The Caspian's shores inhaled investment and exhaled disputes.
The Ural's torn shoreline recorded decades of agricultural ambition with geological patience. Environmental ministries inherited dossiers thicker than their budgets and learned to speak two languages at once: science that measured decline in parts per million, and politics that measured it in terms per term. The end of the Union had not ended the dams or the canals, the mines or the refineries. It had ended the pretense that their consequences belonged to no one. Cross-border commissions formed like rafts and drifted on the currents of goodwill and scarcity. In villages downriver from smelters, residents learned to read fish the way meteorologists read clouds. In cities, summer smog wrote its own editorials. The narrative placed a camera at water level and asked a simple, unromantic question: can a region rebuild legitimacy if its rivers remain sick? The answer, like the current, moved forward, but not straight. What would happen when the first generation raised in the quiet after 1991 measured adulthood by the clarity of their sky?
Technology, the quiet insurgent, rearranged attention. Personal computers arrived on office desks where typewriters had anchored posture. Modems screeched an opening in the once sealed information space. Satellite dishes bloomed on rooftops like metallic sunflowers, turning toward constellations of channels that ignored borders. The internet, tentative at first, taught citizens to triangulate truth by cross-referencing sources at breakfast. Censorship recalibrated from forbidding to flooding, from scarcity of content to abundance that required curation. State news lost its monopoly not through confrontation, but through competition with novelty. A boy in a provincial town downloaded a software compiler and built a company. A historian uploaded scanned memoirs that would have once circulated in carbon copies. A banker checked global prices before approving a loan. The same wires also carried scams, rumors, and the old seduction of conspiracies packaged in new fonts. The film did not mythologize this era. It measured how connectivity turned silence into noise, and how noise forced citizens to become their own editors. If the Union had fallen partly because information learned to disobey, what would follow in a landscape where information no longer waited to be asked? And when every household became a small station, who would learn to schedule themselves?
Education, the long game, pivoted with uneven grace. Curricula replaced paragraphs that had praised central victories with paragraphs that mapped regional pluralities. Teachers, veterans of the earlier canon, translated new narratives with care, wary of replacing one orthodoxy with another. Universities sought partnerships abroad and accreditation at home, and lecture halls became airports of ideas, arrivals delayed, departures rerouted, connections missed and made. A new vocabulary entered classrooms: entrepreneurship, civil society, comparative law. At the same time, laboratories waited for reagents that budgets postponed, and libraries waited for journals that subscriptions skipped. Students felt the fracture as opportunity and insecurity, a double exposure.
Many left, promising to return, and some did, bringing habits that fit badly before they fit well. The absence of a final battle meant schools could continue through the transition, protecting a line of continuity that might yet become a rope. But continuity alone could not carry reform. It required intention. Would the next generation inherit a story of exhaustion turned to renewal? Or would they inherit only the caution to avoid heights? The answer lingered in corridors where posters for exchange programs curled at the edges and chalk dust lifted like quiet weather.
Public health mapped the body of change with unflinching precision. Life expectancy dipped in several places as the 1990s advanced, an index too blunt to ignore and too complex to blame on a single cause. Alcohol intensified its old companionship with sorrow. Clinics lost staff to better-paying roles abroad or in private practice. Vaccination schedules faltered, then recovered, guided by networks of nurses who measured heroism in syringes and steps. Mental health, once a politicized instrument, began to claim its rightful domain, though stigma lagged policy. Pharmacies filled with glossy boxes and uncertain advice. Counterfeit pills traveled the same routes as imported cereal. Over time, some systems rallied, rebuilding with insurance schemes and family medicine, while others treaded water, held up by the endurance of practitioners rather than the design of ministries. The quiet end of the Union had spared the region pandemics of violence. It had not spared it the epidemics of stress. A society's resilience revealed itself in its waiting rooms. The film watched the intake nurse stamp forms and glance at a clock that measured both shift length and reform timelines. Would the pulse steady before the patience ran out?
Culture continued its slow harvest of meanings. The cinema of the 1990s turned from epics of sacrifice to chamber pieces of survival. Then, decades later, to reassessments that attempted synthesis without absolution. Literature wrote the long sentences necessary to accommodate irony and tenderness in the same breath. Pop music mixed the nostalgia of Soviet melodies with imported rhythms and local slang, producing anthems that could be sung by a new crowd without requiring them to forget their parents' songs. Museums curated rooms where visitors could sit with headphones and hear testimonies from the Gulag next to interviews with factory workers from the stagnation years. The juxtaposition refusing simplification. Holidays shifted balance, some gaining solemnity, others shedding it. Calendars negotiating between grief and celebration. The absence of a final battle denied artists the easy palette of victory and defeat. It offered instead the complex color of ambivalence. Audiences learned to appreciate that color, though at times they longed for primary hues. The film paused on a stage after applause, empty chairs still warm, and asked, will the arts continue to translate fatigue into form, or will they be recruited again as trumpets for certainty? Economists drew curves. Citizens drew conclusions. The early shocks of liberalization produced growth in some sectors and shrinkage in others.
The social safety net, once coarse but wide, was rewoven into targeted programs that sometimes targeted and sometimes missed. Inequality, that persistent analyst, announced its presence in skylines and in statistics. Governments tried tax codes, subsidies, tariffs, and privatization schemes with varying mixtures of textbook and improvisation. Some achieved equilibrium of modest prosperity. Others cycled between boom and contraction. The currency, a weather vane for trust. The sequence lacked the drama of barricades, but contained the suspense of balance sheets. The camera studied a factory that found a niche in export markets after years of near closure. It studied another that auctioned its machines like organs. Both stories belonged to the same landscape. The quiet end had turned the citizens of a planned system into shareholders of uncertainty. Would the dividends arrive in time to justify the risk? Or would the risk calcify into caution that slowed the next